Hi, my name is Kelley Tilmon, and I am the Field Crop Entomologist at Ohio State University. And the Ohio Soybean Council has asked me to talk about some of the summer crop insects and what you need to watch for. Uh, Insect pests sometimes feel very unpredictable. However, with our most common pests, fortunately, there's a certain seasonality to them. So we don't know in any given year if they're going to be a problem or not, but we know when they're most likely to be a problem in the summer just because of their life cycle. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things you need to look out for the rest of the summer, starting in July. And even though this is a soybean focused presentation, I know most soybean farmers also farm other crops, so I will mention some of the bigger pests in some of our other Ohio field crops. In July, typically we don't have our worst insect outbreaks in July, but July is the month where you can start to see problems coming. So July is the best time to ramp up your scouting efforts. And some of the pests that we start to see gearing up in July are various defoliating insects that chew on soybean leaves, stink bugs that affect the soybean seeds, potato leaf hoppers, and western bean cutworm. There are a number of different insect pests that can defoliate soybeans. There are various caterpillar species, Japanese beetles, bean leaf beetles, and ca grasshoppers are another one. Fortunately, we don't have to scout each of those insects individually. We can just use an overall defoliation threshold. And this is a method where you are assessing the level of damage and deciding when to treat based on the level of damage that can be being caused by a number of different defoliators. We have recent newly devised defoliation thresholds. These are crop stage dependent. So in the stage of V1 to R2, so vegetative through bloom, we recommend treatment if you reach 30% defoliation. R3 to R5, when the pods are developing and filling, we bump that down to a 10% tolerance for defoliation. And then in R6, the full seed stage, 15% defoliation. Now, most of our soybean defoliators tend to start on the edges. And so often, if you're only checking the edge of the field, you'll see worse defoliation on the edges. And you don't want to make your decision for the whole field just based on the edge. You may decide if the problem isn't in the interior of the field to just let it pass, or also an edge treatment is sometimes possible. So don't make your decision for the whole field based on the edge. Also make sure the defoliating insects are still there. Sometimes these are ephemeral pests. They're only there, they create damage, and then they leave. There's no point spraying if they've left. Stink bugs are pests that feed directly on the developing seed. They have straw-like mouth parts that they punch through the pod into the seed and cause damage to the seed. If this happens early enough in the development, you'll just have an aborted seed. If it occurs later in the seed development, you'll have shrunken, shriveled seeds. They first start to make their appearance in June, but you really don't find them in the soybeans until July when the pods are starting to form, since they do feed on those pods. So we recommend that you monitor from the R3 stage from pod onset onward. And this is another edge pest that sometimes an edge treatment can nip a growing problem in the bud. Our recommended thresholds for stink bugs are based on sweeping. If you take various sets of 10 sweeps each in various parts of the field, take an average of the number of stink bugs, both immatures and matures, that you're finding in those 10 sweep sets. If you are averaging 4 stink bugs per 10 sweeps, and you are growing for grain, that is our recommended threshold. If you are growing for seed or food grade, we bump that down. The seed quality is that much more important, and we bump that threshold down to 2 stink bugs per 10 sweep set. Looking into alfalfa, July is the time to start looking out for potato leafhoppers. These may be a threat in alfalfa from July through September, especially when you have hot, dry conditions. And the telltale damage is what we call hopper burn, sort of a frosted appearance to the field. But you don't want it to let it get to that point. That affects the alfalfa quality. And July is also when we start to look for western bean cutworms in corn. These are moths that fly into the field starting in mid-June, but peak flight is usually in mid-July. They lay eggs in the corn, and those hatch into caterpillars that feed on the corn kernels. And 10, 7, 6 years ago, this was kind of a big problem in Ohio. In the recent 5 years or so, it has not been so much. However, we do monitor for it. We have a statewide monitoring system where we trap and we report the numbers of western bean cutworms each week in the Ohio State University Corn newsletter. And if you haven't already subscribed, I highly recommend you subscribe to the corn newsletter. In spite of the name, it isn't just about corn, it's about all of our agronomic crops and has a wealth of information updated weekly throughout the summer. Very useful resource. In August, this is when we see most of our insect pest problems in field crops. To look for in August, again, potato leafhoppers and alfalfa, spider mites in both soybean and corn, but especially soybean. Defoliators in soybean may be ramping up in August if they got their start in July. Stink bugs, as long as those pods are still forming and filling, we need to worry about stink bugs. And something we hear less about nowadays, but are periodic pockets in Ohio still of soybean aphid. These defoliators and stink bugs can start to cause more damage as the pods are filling and they really need that energy to fill the pods. So that's why we have lower tolerance for things like defoliators in August. And soybean aphids, we still recommend 250 aphids per plant as a treatment threshold. Again, not super common, but every year we have at least 1 or 2 calls about it. Keep watching for those potato leafhoppers and alfalfa, and especially if the weather has been both hot and dry, look out for spider mites in soybean. And that dry is a really important component. Moisture is the enemy of spider mites. If it's been a rainy August, chances are you're not going to have problems. If it's been a dry August, often in about mid-August is when we start to see problems with spider mites. And Lorsban was one of our go-to insecticides for spider mites, and that has become if not outright banned, then very difficult to get. The status of that one keeps moving backward and forward. But we are, because it is not something we can count on having, we are moving away from recommending it because there are also several newer miticides on the market, which, even though more expensive, are even more effective than the older products for using against spider mites, especially if you catch them early when damage is still in the lower or mid canopy. In September, September can get interesting because we have some pests that are particularly problems in the fields that are still green while other fields are drying down. And I particularly tell people to look out for stink bugs and bean leaf beetles in fields that were perhaps planted later or maturity groups that are maturing later, because what happens is as certain fields are drying down but others are still green, these insects will leave the fields that are drying down and move into the fields that are still green, kind of a magnet for stink bugs and bean leaf beetles. And bean leaf beetles we worry about because they feed on the pods at this stage, which can reduce the seed quality, cause damage, open the pods to disease. We advise you to make a treatment decision on bean leaf beetles based on how much pod damage you're seeing. So go around to, let's say, 10 different plants, spread around the field, pick off all the pods, count the total number of pods, and the number of pods where you see feeding damage, kind of like a pock mark on the outside. Uh, Figure out the percent pod damage if you are hovering around 10 to 15% pod damage, and if the bean leaf beetles are still around and they haven't left yet, and if the pods are still green, that would be a good treatment point. If the pods have started to senesce, it's all over but the shouting and no point in treating. And also watch out for those stink bugs that are going into the fields that are still green. Soybean aphids can be a problem in early September, and that is also the time when, towards the middle or end of September, they migrate to their overwintering plant, which is buckthorn. This picture is soybean aphids on a buckthorn getting ready to spend the winter. Winter wheat. If you grow winter wheat, chances are you've heard about the fly-free dates, and uh, that is very important for minimizing problems from Hessian fly and also a couple of aphid species that can affect winter wheat and transmit a barley yellow dwarf virus. If you follow the fly-free dates, there's been widespread adoption of these dates, and it's really reduced the amount of Hessian fly damage. That, along with certain resistance traits that are very common now. And happily, these fly-free dates are also the agronomically best dates for the planting of winter wheat. So it's easy to justify sticking to those dates, which will really help reduce your problems. That is a very brief summary of these things to watch for in the summer. You can get more detailed information from the corn newsletter. Just Google corn OSU newsletter and you'll come to a link where you can sign up. Soyohio.org has a wealth of information on soybean management. And then our Ag Insects webpage, aginsects.osu.edu, for management advice on many insect pests in many field crops. With that, I'm happy to take your questions if you would like to email me. Check out that website. And as always, we thank the Ohio Soybean Council and the Ohio Soybean Checkoff for supporting the work that helps you manage soybean better. Thank you, and please do reach out and contact me if any questions.